Do you remember those pressure cooker bombers in Chelsea in like 2016? This may be only a thing if you lived in New York at the time, but it did happen. Nobody died, so people forgot about it. But that night I was on the subway in Chelsea with my big cousin Emma, and she was my idol in the way that only a big cousin can be. Our train was held there for a long, long time because of the bombs, and that evening she gave me one of her little white wired ear pods so that we could kill time listening to one of her favorite shows. That was Last Podcast on the Left. I didn't really get podcasts, but I was game to like whatever she liked. I remember it being loud, even though it was through only one ear and through the noise of the subway train. But it was kind of funny and very crude. I think that they were yelling over the 911 call from when that chimp ate a lady's face a number of years ago. A year later, I was freelance writing about stuff for Elite Daily. I was doing that to supplement my limited funds and social circle in law school, and I got a chance to profile Last Podcast Ben Kissel. He was running for office in Brooklyn, so I interviewed him, and he also needed campaign help, and my cool cousin thought he was cool, so obviously I did that. Then his friends needed interviews for a documentary about his campaign, so I did that, and the rest, as they say, is history. Actually, I was so stoked to have some new friends. Since moving to New York, I really had only met other law students, and I was too burned out during school days to effectively socialize. And honestly, the little creative freak in me who had studied creative writing in undergrad felt super malnourished in the legal world. Plus, my cool cousin had moved away, so I was feeling lonely. And here was a group of creative freaks, the ones who actually seemed professional and successful and engaged in politics. It was all way better than I would have expected from the killer chimp hollering episode. I felt that I'd maybe found a social circle and a potentially fulfilling direction to take my career after law school in one fell swoop. So by the campaign's end, in Ben's defeat, I'm sorry for the spoiler, but it's been a number of years, I had developed growing friendships with many of LPN's New York cohort. The network at the time was bicoastal in New York and LA, but has since fully migrated its entirety to LA. For the better part of a decade now, my personal and professional bonds with LPN have continued to deepen. I will always feel so much gratitude and nostalgia for so many things. Many indelible memories with many people. The affection I still feel may sound implausible, but God help me, it is true. Over the years, I have been a guest on 21 LPN programs. I counted. 20 podcast or streaming episodes, and then the 12-hour Twitch subathon. And the shows include some Place Under Neith or SPUN, Fraudsters, Page 7, and the Last Podcast Network channel. All of my work with them has been unpaid, but I still was and am grateful for it. You know, these balances don't tip overnight or immediately. For a long time, I was mostly gruntled, if you will, for the experience, the exposure, and what I hoped was mutual respect and friendship. I mean, Jackie wrote me a recommendation for my master's program. Natalie and I were together last year at When We Were Young Fest, when my grandma died, during My Chemical Romance's Helena, no less, which is about a dead grandma. 2 co-owner couples have let me stay in their homes with them. I dated and fell in love with their former producer, Travis Morningstar, and then he eventually moved in with me when quarantine started in 2020. Because of Brooke Rogers, and thus because of Last Podcast and Ben, I got to find and meet my late uncle's partner, who nursed him until his death from AIDS. Carolina joined us for a cautiously celebratory beach trip right post-COVID, when 2 girls at the beach were swept out to sea right in front of us, and we all sprang into action, but only one of them was found alive. Even Ben could be so incredibly kind and warm. Ben at his best is welcoming and silly and protective and encouraging. He's not somebody who always replies or shows up, but when he does, he's often been the first one to be amiable and loyal and inclusive to me. He was the one who made the biggest missteps here. But one reason of many driving me to write and put words to this is to clarify that, in my opinion, he's more one straw of many that broke the camel's back, rather than one aberrant bad apple spoiling the bunch. That's a lot of metaphors, and enough metaphors for now. In short, I have lived a really strange and wonderful lifetime with the LPN people, and I feel truly conflicted as I put all this into words. When I contemplated kind of whistle blowing my life up, between Natalie's first 2 suggestions that I stop asking about Ben or consider leaving SPUN, and then her final directive that I must go, I reached a kind of sinking realization. The allegations of abuse that to me sounded credible and known to leadership for longer than the 2 weeks that at that time had already passed since it went public, and then LPN's public silence on the abuse allegations for too long, in my opinion, the vague original rehab story with really coincidental timing, and then the somewhat behind-the-scenes lack of clarity, seeming lack of PR or legal directives or any other signs of an adequately coordinated, formalized effort to take it seriously. It all kind of fit a pattern that for years I had been trying not to see. Remember, in around 2020, it was Ben himself who was deputized as the LPN HR department. As somebody who is myself too abnormal for traditional workplaces, I hate arbitrary norms, trust me. But we all have to recognize that some formalities have become norms because they're the ones that protect people. As LPN faced here an opportunity for making a definitive turn towards growth and accountability and transparency, I watched each successive and lagging misstep with so much dismay. LPN's silence and inaction had, at the time that I faced this choice, already yielded tangible harm to someone. There's business and personal platforms had been targeted by LPN fans for weeks, had consequently been deleted twice over, and she was in the process of regularly posting videos pleading with LPN leadership in tears and obvious terror to help her. And all I got, relatively behind the scenes when I asked about it, it was the Ben's going to rehab for 4 weeks line. She then asked me to, quote, understand that Ben going to rehab is a much larger reason than terror, and called him miserable and a train wreck, before asking me not to bring Ben up to her or Henry again. Well, her quick default to anger was not quite new to me. This was just too much to digest for me from a woman who I knew as a host of a victims advocacy show on a true crime network that is also co-owned by her spouse. As I saw it, my only choices were 1, say nothing, fall in line and protect what remained of my unpaid role on the network, because to me, the already imbalanced friendship element had kind of faded, and do that on a show whose victim advocacy mission felt increasingly hollow. At this point, who was previously a stranger to me, had seen my comments of support and reached out, called me crying, shaking, and begging for my help to get through to LPN to call off the fans. Nobody at the network had spoken to her or about her publicly in the over 2 weeks now since she had gone public. Choice 2, thus, was voice my discomfort with LPN's handling of the allegations, and later their handling of my questions and open support, and leverage my relationship with the network, relative credibility as a lawyer, to take a public stand for one that would be harder to ignore than just her. But I knew that if I did that, I would have to do it full-throatedly to make any difference. I couldn't leave quietly. I couldn't just be obedient and wait hopefully to be let back in someday. I couldn't excuse behavior or stay neutral. The only way to call attention to a troubling pattern was to fully, loudly detail the pattern, and that made any harm reduction feel kind of impossible. Though I made the decision that I did, I know from how hard it was and from personal experience beforehand, also how easy it is to stay in a holding pattern, even if you know that parts of it are a little troubling. I don't think that any LPNers are bad people, even Ben. If any one factor had tipped, if anyone at LPN had reached out to me with kindness or proof that they were pursuing a professional remedy. To this point, by the way, none have since I posted my first video. Or say if they had acknowledged it or their own accountability earlier, because remember that didn't happen first for over 2 weeks, and then a month after Rolling Stone reached out for comment, they gave a vague statement. We'll get to that. But hell, even if I'd been under a paid contract, potentially, I might have made the opposite decision to stay in the phalanx. But they still took chances on me, and it still turns my stomach to know that they likely regret letting me in. It's tough because outside my own paradigm and hurt feelings, it's a different kind of disappointing that, by all appearances, the only reaction they've had to my actions and treatment and comments is that regret for letting me in. Ultimately, nobody has a come-to-Jesus moment on someone else's timeline, which is relevant to remember. I can at least appreciate that the night after I pushed Natalie about my concern for and she definitively asked me to leave SPUN, LPN posted their first acknowledgement of her harassment and asked it to stop, albeit in an Instagram story. And there are more details to fill this out later, because it is detail-heavy back-and-forth texting, but that evening, Last Podcast posted this in their Instagram story, though to be fair, not in a grid post. Before plunging into my why more and specifics, I'll reiterate that I'm not Taylor's lawyer, and I've never been involved with anyone at LPN in a legal capacity. None of my guest appearances on LPN were under any employment or independent contractor, consultant contract, and I was never paid for anything I did for or with LPN. The more I learn about the financials and pay disparities from different folks, the more that last part irks me, but that's neither here nor there right now. While I do tend to traffic in legal commentary, this story and my opinions thereon bears repeating for other reasons beyond the legal, like illustrating where and how law and policy can fall short. I think that knowledge of those gaps in the law and the human costs of certain actions and gaps in law can help us learn to make effective progress. But still, I want to be really, really clear that none of my statements here should be taken as accusations of criminal or civil liability, and I want to doubly emphasize that because some phrases that I have used, will use, like domestic violence or willful blindness, the word reckless, can hold legal and conversational meaning. So I want to clarify that here, if I use anything like that, I always mean the latter, conversational meaning, not legal.